Okay, great. Thank you all. Appreciate the opportunity to present. So I'd like to first acknowledge coworkers on this work. Raju Kamal was a postdoc in my group and actually got her as a graduate student. So let me begin. Be talking about non-volatile particulate matter across multiple length scales. And so this was in coordination, in collaboration with an EPA and or AFR Air Force Research Lab collaboration, where basically they have a multi-year ongoing study called variant studies, 1, 2, 3, and 4, standing for variable response in aircraft nvPM testing. And again, I should also mention this was Arnold Engineering Air Force Development Center, who made the site and engine, AJ85 engine, available. They have a couple of measurement goals in terms of line loss estimation for SAE determination purposes, as well as evaluating mass and PM mass measurement instrumentation. Our goal here in our work was on assessing the variation in PM physical and morphological characteristics for biofuel blends as a function of engine power. And so we looked at the elemental carbon emissions, strictly speaking, size, variation, and nanostructure. By way of brief outline, we'll talk about postulated fuel compositional impact on particle formation processes. That's the broad overview, but look at some varied experimental observations and try to formulate a singular rationalization for their collective observation. So we looked at aggregate size correlation with engine power, primary and aggregate size correlations, as well as fuel compositional impacts, both upon elemental carbon and effects on particulate formation, chemistry, and nanostructure. So this was not a turbofan, to be clear. It is a turbojet, a J85 combustor. And we looked at, well, the nvPM across multiple length scales. That's the reason for the decadal length scales, because we looked at the aggregate size, primary particle size, and the nanostructure within the particles. Each of those length scales bears relevance to its health and or environmental implications. Namely, the particle size itself governs the surface area, which is relevant for atmospheric aging of the particulate, versus size and morphology both govern light scattering and absorption. I'll not go into the health effects here. That's a separate study. So panel on the left-hand image is showing you basically a real TEM image of the aggregate as we saw these. Most of the particulate was collected on thin carbon films. That's the background that you see. And again, we looked at aggregate structure, primary particle size, and nanostructure within the primary particles. And so that's where our measurements, observations, encompassed roughly 3 orders of magnitude. In terms of analyses, we applied TEM and image processing, whether it be ImageJ for primary aggregate or our custom algorithms for the nanostructure quantification per se. Sample sizes were significant in terms of a few dozen TEM images for each power fuel condition and or hundreds of measurements within any given condition set. The fuels were Jet A and or blends with hydrotreated camelina biofuel. Diagram on the left-hand side is the basis or the descriptor for our postulate that basically in the very high turbulence of a jet combustor, the fuel-air mixing competes with the kinetic timescales. Specifically, that is to say the physical mixing timescale, if you will, of fuel-rich regions with air compete with the kinetic timescales for fuel pyrolysis reactions. The significance of that interaction, or I should say competition, relates to the particle formation processes, in particular for each of the 2 fuels. A fuel laden with roughly 20-21% aromatics, such as Jet A, is primed for soot formation. It has the requisite aromatics to already start particle nucleation and or then growth from those same aromatics. That's shown on the left part versus the biofuel, devoid of aromatics per se. Necessarily, to produce those aromatics, the fuel itself, alkylparaffinic molecules, need to undergo various pyrolysis reactions to produce unsaturated species, namely acetylene, to produce the first aromatic ring. So there's a whole set of pyrolysis reactions, aromatic formation, prior to the start of particle nucleation and or then subsequent aggregation of those primary particles. And so that is the difference, we believe, that collectively explains the observations that I will next present to you. So to start with a more macroscopic view, larger scale, looking at the aggregate size. These are representative, as I mentioned, there are a few dozen for any given fuel power condition, but these are a series of representative aggregate images for Jet A 30% blend or a 70% blend. And you can see the general trend that with increasing biofuel blend content, there's an overall decrease in size of, well, the aggregates. There's also a change in terms of the structure, although that's a little bit harder to see that with a higher blend fuel, there are fewer primary particles per aggregate. In principle, we believe that the lower number concentration of primary particles associated with the aromatic dilution of the fuel leads to a decreased rate of coalescence. Strictly speaking, in aerosol science, that should lead to a more dendritic aggregate, but that's a little bit offset here by the fact that the aggregates in panel C are somewhat smaller as well. This graph is showing the trend of aggregate size quantified from those images for the different biofuels blends and compared to Jet A as a function of engine thrust. As you can see, the red to blue to green, there's a decreasing slope. What that decreasing slope represents is a decreasing dependence of aggregate size upon engine thrust with increasing biofuel blend. Also, and you can see for any given engine thrust, there's a decreased average aggregate size with increasing biofuel content, not surprisingly. But the idea is that with dilution of the fuel carried, fuel borne, that is to say, aromatics, there's an increasing shift of aromatic dependence on aromatic formation from the fuel powerhouse itself, leading to that decreased dependence then upon engine thrust. A different correlation would be between primary particle size and aggregate size. There's not, strictly speaking, an inherent fundamental correlation between these two physical measures or length scales. It does suggest, however, that for both Jet A, the 70 and 30% camelina blended fuels, that there's an underlying cause factor that leads to this correlation between these two different length scales. Namely, I'll suggest the fuel aromatics. So if moving to a more macroscopic, measurable, observable elemental carbon per se concentration, one can see here that compared to Jet A, the 30 versus 70% blended fuels, red to blue to green, there's a much larger variation in aggregate size. The different points, by the way, simply reflect different power measurements, thrust values at which the samples were collected, measurements were made. But there's a very large range of aggregate size for Jet A associated with inherently the different thrust values, as I mentioned. But there's a change in slope, a rather significant change in slope going from smaller aggregates to larger aggregates. That change in slope, I'll suggest, represents the shift in the dependence of aromatic source. Early on, small aggregates, low thrust values, that represents the dominance of the fuel carried aromatics in terms of determining both aggregate size and or elemental carbon, whereas at higher thrusts, the change in slope, the stronger dependence, reflects the increasing shift of aromatic formation upon the higher temperatures associated with the thrust rather than the fuel carried aromatics per se. But you can see that with increasing biofuel blend content, there's not near as large a range of aggregate size, but nor is there a strong dependence. There's a lesser dependence of EC upon aggregate size. But there's a similarity of the slope at higher thrust associated with Jet A versus the entire span for the two biofuel blends, suggesting that the same physical processes are leading to, well, the aggregate formation and or aromatics for each of these two fuels associated with aromatic formation. looking at that more explicitly, one can look at the correlation between elemental carbon concentration versus engine thrust. Again, the different points being the different thrust values here now more clearly shown. But with increasing biofuel blend content, there's a decreasing slope representing a decreasing dependence of, well, elemental carbon, now measured as concentration, with increasing biofuel blend content. And again, in general, for most thrusts, given within measurement values, there's a decreased concentration of elemental carbon with increasing biofuel blend content, red to blue to green, at any given thrust value. If one looks at the nanostructure, yet a finer length scale, magnification shown here in the sequence of TEM images from left to right, A to B, for Jet A, 30% and or 70% blended fuel, you can see that there's really a lack of distinct nanostructure, but you can see clearly all the very small carbon lamella occurring in stacks of 2 and 3 in the Jet A. But with increasing biofuel blend content, those lamella are not necessarily elongated, but they become somewhat curved. You can see a progression of curvature, I'll suggest, as one metric of nanostructure, length being another one. But as my arrow is pointing here, you're seeing that there's curvature evolving, forming, developing with increasing biofuel blend content from A to B to C. We have developed over a couple decades now image algorithms that can quantify those images for different measures. That is to say, the length of the lamella, the separation distance between individual lamella, or curvature of lamella as well. A summary histogram plot of the curvature for those 3 fuels is shown here on the left-hand panel, showing the percent of fringes for different bend values of, well, lamella. And you can see that for red to blue to green, or green to blue to red actually, there's a decreasing, there's a distribution of tortuosity, but the fuel that exhibits the most tortuosity across bends is that with the highest biofuel blended content, or in other words, with increasing biofuel blend content for any given bend category, there's an increasing degree of curvature, that being what I said in the previous slide. And so, again, we believe this change in the fuel chemistry is manifested in now not just aggregate size, not just particle size, but also nanostructure as well. And so this slide is meant to illustrate the idea of our postulate, that is to say, a fuel rich in aromatics, fuel carried aromatics, such as Jet A, once temperature is sufficient, it can begin aromatic particle inception formation growth immediately because it already has the aromatics to do so, versus the biofuel, or high blend values of such, are forced necessarily to undergo, well, the necessary pyrolysis. Those pyrolysis reactions require a kinetic time, or impose, I'll suggest, a kinetic delay time. That delay time to form the requisite aromatic concentrations for particle inception and or subsequent growth allow or compete with fuel air mixing, which allows a change in the equivalence ratio in the fuel-rich pockets in which the particles form. And so the conditions under which soot formation occurs in the biofuel blend case compared to the Jet A case are different. They are different both not only in the temperature, but they're also significantly different in the equivalence ratio, with allowing for dilution by turbulent mixing. That dilution is significant because basically it suggests that it's not a fuel-rich pocket per se. It strictly is, yes, but it also means that the soot particulate is forming under partially premixed conditions. Those premixed conditions can, in fact, then lead to the C5 and the resulting curvature that we see in the nanostructure. So we did, or performed Chemkin calculations to try to verify that supposition. Shown here are the results of those calculations for a perfectly stirred reactor plug flow system combined, showing one summary plot here basically as the ratio of the C5 to C6 concentrations for 2 molecules representing the 2 fuels, the aromatic content of Jet A versus the paraffinic of, well, the biofuel. And what you can see is that the C5 to C6, C5 being that necessary entity for curvature in lamella, there's a strong dependence upon equivalence ratio for but the one paraffinic component, not the aromatic, but for the paraffinic, suggesting and supporting then that the formation of C5 is based on paraffinic content and partial premixing, again, fostered, promoted by the turbulence, competing with pyrolysis kinetics, but basically the soot from the biofuel across multiple length scales is showing the manifestation of that partial premixing. So that brings me to a few summary points. For the slides that I've shown you, where the observations, aggregate size increases with power, dependence is lower for the biofuel, and for any given power, the aggregate size decreases, as does the primary particle size. Both of those, aggregate and primary particle, are correlated, but the HT-RTM analyses also show fringe tortuosity now increasing as a measure of curvature with increasing biofuel content. But the common thread rationalizing these observations is that the competition between aromatic concentration, requisite implicit for particle inception and growth, competes with the turbulent mixing. So in other words, pyrolysis kinetics, when they are required, impose a delay, allowing turbulent mixing, changing the local phi under which the particulate forms. To further amplify that point, as stated again here, increasing biofuel content is lowering the aromatic concentration of the fuel, that's clear, but it's placing an increasing emphasis or dependence upon fuel pyrolysis reactions to form the requisite aromatics for particle inception and growth. And so with increasing biofuel content, there's an increasing dependence on, or imposition, shall we say, of kinetic time delay for pyrolysis reactions, allowing more fuel-air mixing by turbulence. So the fuel-rich soot-forming regions are still there. They may be fewer in number, but in general, overall, they're more diluted. That is to say that soot is forming under partially premixed conditions under lowered equivalence ratio. The significance of that is that there's a lower gross species concentration resulting in smaller primary particles, but also with lowered precursor, aka aromatic concentrations, the particle inception rate is lowered, meaning there's a lower number concentration, and as a consequence then, aggregates then become smaller too. But with increasing partial premixing, supported also by the ChemKin calculations, so too the nanostructure reflects this chemistry of partial premixing, or fuel-rich regions yet, promoted by the biofuel, leading to the curvature in the nanostructure across the different blend levels. I'd like to briefly acknowledge this was a multi-participant team study variant. We had the easy part, shall I say, but this was led by the EPA, both John Kinsey, now retired, as well as folks in Michigan, the whole team there, as well as the courtesy and facilities of the U.S. Air Force, the AEDC development team, led by Robert Howard and Mary Ford in particular, for access in time on the J85 engine. With that, I thank you for your interest and opportunity to present. My contact information follows there.
Thanks very much, Randy, for an excellent presentation. I don't think we've got time for a live question there to keep the schedule. So if people could ask that in the chat, that would be appreciated.
Yep.
Thanks very much. So we move on now to Kimberly Bowl from the University of Cambridge, Department of Chemical Engineering.